I will focus in today's talk mostly on policy aspects, how to actually operate in conditions that are far from optimal, very difficult, in fact, and people in Beirut, people in this country, certainly know from their own experience in not too distant past or even now what difficulties there are in real life, economic as well as other aspects of life. So I will focus on those policy aspects. Being an academic, I have some theoretical, even philosophical issues, but I will skip over them, and if anybody is interested during the question and answer period, we certainly can discuss them. I was preparing myself for this talk in the standard academic way, and then I listened to this song, Beirut, which is by a very famous poet who passed away not so long ago. I think you all know him and his work. And it moved me very deeply, so I started translating the poem, and that gave me the inspiration to address some of the difficulties in real life. In especially economic and political life. So without further ado, let me get into the talk. I will be discussing during the talk not all of the cases that Rami mentioned, although in my writing I have discussed them, sometimes even in full book-length format. So you are welcome to look them up. Or write to me. Some are probably not published yet, and I can send them to you and send you links to some of the work as well. So this is the basic outline, but I will be really focusing on item numbers 4 and 5. What might work for countries at different levels of development in the medium run, by which we economists actually mean anywhere between, say, 2 years to 10 years. And long run is anything beyond 10 years. John Maynard Keynes, who was an economist, one of the best ever, once said that in the long run we are all dead. But I think he was not quite right, because our children and grandchildren will still be alive. We should have that much optimism. In fact, Keynes also famously wrote an essay called Economics for Our Grandchildren. That was the approximate title. And there he was actually optimistic to the extent that he felt that in 100 years from the time that he was writing, economics, this dismal science, will have disappeared. And we will have solved the economic problem, and life would be more aesthetically pleasing and ethically enriching. Unfortunately, looking around the world today, we see that Keynes's prediction hasn't quite come true, although we are making progress. So development is a complicated question. One small part of it, and I emphasize the adjective small, is growth. And there are some key questions just to motivate. The last one may be of some interest here. Why have the Middle East and North African economies largely failed under what is called neoliberalism? And again, I will not give very careful definitions, but I can address them during Q&A. And in my writing, of course, being an academic, I have dealt with these things in nauseating detail. But roughly, we can identify neoliberalism with two things. One is a kind of ideological, I must even say non-thinking, knee-jerk approach to free market economy, as it is called. No regulations would be probably the best kind of economic life one could have, according to this doctrine. And the other one is privatization of everything. Now, I should say that I believe in public-private partnership, at least during our lifetime, or my lifetime. But one needs to think through the details, and the devil really is in the details. And people who make practical policies, some of whom I've found to be very thoughtful, much more thoughtful than academic economists who think in very categorical terms sometimes. They think in great detail, in a very painstaking way, how something may or may not work. If you privatize a large firm, for example, will it work or will it not work? How can we really answer that question? And these people actually know a lot of the details that we must know in order to even pose the questions that follow from this big question correctly. So I'll get to that in context soon. And this is something purely academic, but just very briefly, economists work with models, which are abstractions, and they can be quantified, and that's helpful. But they don't always think carefully about exact causal relations, though some of them do. And we must do that in order to answer very precise, concrete questions like the one that I just posed. Now, there are many ways of thinking about even growth. And in our world today, if you focus on the second column there, you'll find that that is much more detailed and I hope more thoughtful. It also talks about modeling institutions and policies, but these are in the context of what I would call post-structuralist type of models. That an economy is not determined just by its structure, which some dogmatic Marxists and others might want us to believe. Structures do matter, however, but not in the way that most dogmatic thinkers think. But policies also matter. And policies can be changed within limits, certainly, even in the short run, and certainly in the medium run and the long run, which would be the time period that I will be focusing during my talk. So we can come back to these issues later. Now, the kind of idea of development that I will be dealing with is mainly the third one here, and this goes back to certainly Amartya Sen, who won the Nobel Prize in 1998 for many of his ideas, including this idea of capabilities. But Sen himself actually credits Adam Smith with first posing the issues in terms of human capabilities. And if you read carefully his book, which almost nobody really does, and people seem to just think that Smith was one thing, which is basically if you had free market, everything would work out. But Smith wasn't that naive. If you read him, you'll see that Smith was first and foremost a moral philosopher. And he thought very carefully about what would enhance real human freedom. And I might just mention in this context that what happened during Smith's time in the 18th century was that a lot of arbitrary, state-centric abuse of political and economic power was then prevalent, and liberals like Smith and the whole school called the Scottish Enlightenment, which involved giants like David Hume and others, they opposed this kind of arbitrary abuse of power. And therefore, they saw the commercial society as a step forward from the unnecessary and arbitrary violence of the state. I think in this, they may have gone too far. And certainly, in light of subsequent historical experience, the social and political movements of the 19th century in England, starting with the Chartist movement, the great movements in continental Europe, and then, of course, the anti-imperialist, anti-colonial movements in other parts of the world, including the Arab world. Those we know. And it was in that context that the idea of universal human rights was proposed. And there, everybody here probably knows that Charles Malik was a key player in the negotiations that led to UDHR in 1948. I should mention the Indian member, Mehta, who was actually, I think, the only woman in that group, and she is the one who introduced the language of gender very early on in Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The part of Universal Declaration that as an economist I'm most concerned about are those clauses where the right to work, the right to livelihood, and related matters are mentioned. In fact, it is a very advanced document in that sense, and everybody here is very concerned about human rights and social justice, and we should know that part of the history of human rights. You may know that the conservative wing of human rights always emphasizes political rights, which of course are very important, political and civil rights, but the economic rights are just as important, I would say. In fact, they have to be comprehensive. They have to occur together. Otherwise, political rights also will lose their meaning. But economic rights without political rights, first of all, may never be enforced, and secondly, even if they're enforced, lack of political development will mean that they can be taken away at any time, and that has been the case in many countries. Okay, now let's get to that, what constitutes success in development. Now, the capabilities approach, which some of us have tried to improved upon to some degrees by grounding it in socioeconomic structures, really tells us that ultimately development success is measured, or is to be measured, by achievements in various arenas of human freedom. And Universal Declaration of Human Rights does a pretty good job, especially considering that it came out in 1948, of articulating what those important areas of freedom really are, including economic freedom for ordinary human beings, not just for business, but really for you and me. And that's important. So what happened in East Asia is that, especially in places like Japan, after the devastation of the Second World War, these countries tried to learn some lessons, and they tried to follow a middle road between arbitrary use of state power, which definitely was very prevalent in Japan, especially from late 1920s onward, and then in places like Korea and Taiwan, which used to be Japanese colonies. After their independence, they made some mistakes, but basically what Japan did in the 50s, they also started doing in the 60s, and the rest is history. At first, both Taiwan and Korea lacked in political freedom, but they had democratization in the 1980s, and they have actually continued, I would say, on an upward trajectory since then. And what really helped them, I would claim, is that they had an openness, but it was strategic. They did not just open everything in their economy. They asked the question, what would be good for us to import, and what do we want to export? And then they followed policies to answer those questions in reasonable practical terms. They also followed macroeconomic policies that were heterodox. By that I mean that it's not that you basically try to take government out of the business of running economy, which has been the prescription of IMF and the World Bank since the 1980s. After Asian financial crisis and then the global crisis, they have changed the rhetoric, although not the practical advice they give to people, because I think they are actually incapable of thinking outside of the box in institutional terms. There are many people within these institutions. I know them because I studied with them. Some of them are my former students. So I know that they think differently, but it is hard to act on the basis of that thinking. I am in the enviable position, although I have worked in international organizations, so I know those from inside as well myself. But I'm lucky that I'm an academic and I can say whatever I want. I try to do it responsibly. So these heterodox policies are again geared towards the specific context of specific countries and specific time periods in the countries. And they don't have ideological knee-jerk approach towards all government intervention or no government intervention. So it's much more nuanced, and during question and answer period, I can give you the details. They also created institutions for productive investment. and agricultural development. They put first things first, and then they thought very carefully about what kind of industrial development would lead to structural change. Just to mention one quick example, Japan was advised by American consultants that they hired in the 1950s that their comparative advantage did not lie in automobiles. So they should forget about having an automobile industry and focus on other things. Japanese looked at them and they are very polite. So they said thank you, and then they went on and built their automobile industry, and the rest is history, as they say. Okay, so they also in the process created technological capabilities. I have worked with Japanese engineers, Korean engineers, since I've written a lot on technology, engineers from Taiwan, and they're all very good. And they have built institutions, educational institutions for training that are comparable to the best institutions anywhere in the world. And they also had to focus, once they have embarked on this path, the opportunities and capabilities for technological learning and innovation. I've written a whole book on actually Korea and Taiwan and their innovation structures, and I discuss in details and show with specific instances of industries and even firms how they actually created this learning and innovation structure. They had direct foreign investment, so they were open, and they were open to foreign aid, especially at the early stage, but they never became dependent on foreign investment and foreign aid. They used it where it was useful, and they said no when they realized that it was really not going to help them. And they also were aware that unthinking kind of enforcement of policies might lead actually to poverty as well as inequalities, and they were careful to implement certain policies. And it varied from one place to another, but Taiwan, Korea, and Japan all did this. China actually deviated from this. Therefore, inequality in China increased tremendously in the 1990s and early 21st century. Then they became aware of this, and now they're trying as much as they can to reduce inequality. But because Chinese growth was so tremendous, their growth rate really has been historically breathtaking. They improved the poverty situation in spite of not paying much attention to this, but now they are paying attention because they have floating population, they have people who are at jobs that don't have much benefits with them, and one forgets this in the West, but China actually has been a revolutionary country since the 1930s, long before the communists took power in 1949. At Yan'an, they created a very egalitarian society, and Chinese Communist Party was much more rooted. It may not be today, but they were much more rooted historically among the workers and peasants in China, the ordinary people. And there was a two-line struggle in Chinese Party always as to whether the party really should simply focus on rapid economic growth and development according to the Soviet model, the Stalinist model, or it should try to actually promote a dialogue with the people and try to serve their interests. So Chinese history is much more complicated. It's complicated throughout, but it's much more complicated in the 20th century and now in the 21st century than most people seem to think it is. Economies especially are guilty of doing very reductionist kind of analysis of China, and I think it really, frankly, comes from their ignorance. Okay, now BRICS, we hear a lot of talks about BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and there too, I would say that they cannot be a complete model of development in terms of capabilities enhancement because they also show uneven development. And China, I just discussed, Brazil and India, they followed these heterodox policies and they grew, but they are not as successful in reducing poverty. In case of Brazil, also reducing inequality as I think they need to be. So there are good things to learn from them, and I can discuss them during the Q&A, but there are things to be wary of as well. South Africa is, in a way, tragic. I wrote a whole book on sanctions against apartheid and what kind of policies South Africa can follow. In fact, it was the first book that laid the whole picture out in useful numbers, I would say. And they had an opportunity, but in the 1990s, they went along basically with IMF-inspired policies, and therefore they are now stuck with huge problems of inequality, including racial and ethnic inequalities, unemployment, and not very impressive growth rate either. So among the BRICS, this S is probably the most problematic, but so is the R. Russia ended up creating a criminal capitalism in the 1990s under Yeltsin and his family and his cronies. Putin improved things somewhat, but he hasn't changed the fundamental structure. He hasn't created a succession system, and Russia still remains largely a resource-dependent economy, and that is not good for a country which has actually very well-educated population, even after all this migration. So Russia really needs to rethink, or actually think for the first time, a reasonable development strategy for itself. Now, I will go through this very quickly, the two case studies of Muslim-majority countries, since we are in the Middle East. One is Indonesia, one is Bangladesh. Both the countries I have done field work in. I was born in East Pakistan, which now is Bangladesh, and I speak the language. I learned Bahasa Indonesia, although Indonesia has many other languages that are more complicated to learn. But I feel, in a way, culturally close enough to both these economies and historically sufficiently aware so that I can make a few comments about them. They are both relatively tolerant, one might even say syncretic, and they practice what is called Panchashila, which comes from ancient Buddhist doctrine, but Indonesia has been explicit about it. Bangladesh, I think, practices it implicitly. By the way, before Islam came to Bengal, most people were Buddhists, and they were forcibly converted into Hinduism by Brahmins who came from outside, and they were very happy to convert to Islam because Islam was much more egalitarian in the context of those times than Hinduism was, which was ridden with caste system and basically a tremendous amount of discrimination towards people from below. And especially Sufis from the Middle East played a big role in converting people, especially in today's Bangladesh, but also in West Bengal, which is in India, to Islam, not by sword, really, but by words and deeds. Okay, so this is Panchashila, and I won't go through all of them. Just to mention that Sukarno, who was the first president of Indonesia after the Indonesian Revolution against the Dutch, he actually wanted to put social justice first and belief in one and only God fifth. But then, you know, politics is always a complicated business, and it got switched in that way. But you see, democracy is also a part of that. And social justice, of course, has always been very important, although in practice, it has been very complicated in Indonesia, especially under the military dictatorship of Suharto, and later the one-party state that Suharto built. But even so, Indonesia grew rapidly, and Indonesians, I should say, and I have spoken with a lot of economists and political scientists and ordinary people in Indonesia, have a deep belief in equality and justice. And events in Indonesia after the Asian financial crisis and their subsequent political developments certainly confirm that. This is what the original Panchashila looked like, which was, you know, thousands of years ago by Gautam Buddha in India. And the first part is in a language called Pali, which comes from Sanskrit. So if there are any Sanskrit scholars in this room, they should be able to understand the Pali part. But this is the, at the bottom, I have translated them into English for you. Okay, so this is Indonesia. And I think, again, we have to combine these precepts, these principles, with actual institution building, and I will come back to that later. For Bangladesh, Bangladesh actually, unlike Indonesia, has a lot of advantages because it has relatively homogeneous population, although it has some minorities, and it has been historically largely secular and tolerant of others. The 1972 Constitution of Bangladesh actually can be upheld as a model of building on ideas of secularism and democracy and social justice. But things changed after the coup in 1975. And it also has a generally growing and diversifying economy, good progress in communications, and gradually improving physical infrastructure. Success of microfinance, for which Grameen Bank won a Nobel Prize, and other poverty reduction policies. It has been successful, especially for a Muslim majority country, in population control. Also, there are semi-skilled workers outside Bangladesh and skilled and semi-skilled workers abroad, including, I think, many in Lebanon right here. And that leads to other problems that we can discuss during Q&A. There is now accumulated experience, and the popular culture, that's very important, and Rami and I were talking about this in the context of MENA, that culture, consciousness, social practices, these are very important. You know, in my earlier reincarnation, I used to be a person in theater and film and music. And I know from personal experience how important they are. During the revolution in Bangladesh, our national liberation movement in 1971, we could fill a stadium with hundreds of thousands of people who came to listen to the songs and dance, you know, and celebrate the call to freedom. And a people's revolution does not take place because a few people conspire, you know, which has been one unfortunate legacy in the Arab world, even in Egypt and certainly in Syria. So a people's revolution has to be made by the people. That's as simple as that. Okay, now problems. What are the problems in Bangladesh? Parliamentary constitutional politics is always difficult. Well, you know that here, certainly. Economic justice, class, gender, ethnic, and religious minorities, these are still problems ongoing. Social stratification and differentiation, inequality has increased since 1975 coups. So even under formal democracy today, these are problems and issues, although I think the government as a whole, and certainly some people within the government whom I know and can speak confidently about, are well aware of this and try their best to solve these problems within the context that we find ourselves in. Creating a vigorous civil society is always a problem. Looking around the Middle East, I find that probably Lebanon still has one of the more vigorous civil societies, and therefore it's especially a pleasure for me to give a talk here. But everywhere we need to invigorate and deepen civil society organizations, and that is just as true of the United States of America as it is anywhere else. And we need to solve the problem of linking with the democratic forces internationally and delinking with the autocratic forces. So we can come back to that also. And now, there are important questions for development and democracy everywhere, but I pose them in the context of Bangladesh. And we can come back to these questions. Many of them are questions that you yourself probably have in your minds. And here are the long-term strategic issues for Bangladesh, but these are similar to strategic issues everywhere, I think. How to follow the East Asian strategic part, but do it better, do it more democratically, as South Korea and Taiwan really could not have done in the 1950s and even in 1960s. In Bangladesh, secularism was actually annulled practically through this 8th Amendment under military government, and even when formal democracy was reestablished, one of the parties which calls itself Bangladesh Nationalist Party allied itself sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, with very right-wing Islamic party, Jamaat-e-Islami, and other parties which are even more to the right of Jamaat-e-Islami, and try to basically bring the country and the government to a standstill and start terrorist activities, or at least condone them. This is not democracy, certainly. There's the problem of inadequate investment and generate adequate employment. Land, asset, wealth distribution remains a problem. Although, as I mentioned here, some of our ministers, and I'm very proud that many of them are women, and Mutia Chaudhary especially is a woman who, when I was a student, she was our leader. She was a leader of the student movement, and we used to call her Agni Kanna. In Sanskrit, it is Agni Kanya, which actually means the daughter of fire, or the woman of fire. And she is still as fiery as she was then. She actually forces bureaucrats to go to the villages and look at the actual conditions of people. She is not cowed by World Bank officials or UN officials or USAID. She is very firm. She takes good advice, and she basically wants to preserve and enhance the interest of the people. And there are several ministries like that. The government is not perfect, but I think given the difficulties in the world, it is trying, at least parts of it, are trying to enhance people's capabilities, which is ultimately the definition of successful development. But it's still on its way to a middle-income country. Indonesia is already a middle-income country. Lebanon, if you look at the official statistics, is middle income. Some people might even say it's rich because average income is something like between $15,000 and $20,000 per capita. But of course, it is unevenly distributed here too. From the little I know about the economy, I have noticed that much. So what can we conclude? First of all, I think deepening democracy is an absolute must. And we have to focus on concrete aspects of good economic and political governance. And it cannot come without some asset redistribution, because as Jefferson long time ago realized in the context of the US, if you have tremendous amount of economic inequality, you cannot have social and political equality. So there must be a rough sort of equality. That's why he wanted this agrarian democracy, which of course was unrealistic given the development of the economy. And on the whole, I think we do need to follow this egalitarian strategy of development. And it must be buttressed by social and political movement, where education really is very, very important. And I think this institute in particular is doing a tremendous job. And we need many more institutes like this everywhere and at many, many different levels in every country of the world. And I also want to emphasize that we have to bring together all the beautiful and deep traditions that exist in terms of spiritual development of people. All great religions emphasize a kind of equality among the people, and they also make people aware of the need for balance between the material sides of our life and the spiritual sides of our life. If we just focus on one part at the expense of another, then it becomes unbalanced. And also, focusing on spiritual side historically has been very hypocritical. The upper classes, the ruling classes have emphasized this so that the ruled classes will not revolt. That is not a very good way to emphasize spiritual development, I would say. And we must build new institutions along with finding new theories. In the future, I would briefly answer, BRICS cannot by themselves lead the way forward. Too much hype about the BRICS is not good for good sound development thinking in the way that I am talking about this. We need a critical postmodern Panchashila. We need to emphasize nonviolence and justice and democracy for all, not just for a few people. We need to create a commons. I call it the creative commons. And I was talking with Laila about urban justice and why we need urban spaces in the form of commons. And we need to create a global commonwealth. And it is a technical subject, but global financial architecture, on which I have written a lot recently, we need that because we need in a global, we live in a global economy, a globalized economy on which we can talk more. I've written quite a bit on what globalization really means. And finally, there is a big strategic question. Do we need a new Bandung? In 1955, there was a conference in Bandung, Indonesia, about non-aligned movement and non-aligned nations, where these small nations, small in terms of power, and wealth, wanted not to follow Stalinist type of socialism on the one hand, or the rhetoric of American democracy, which turned out to be very shallow in the context of Cold War. They wanted to find their own independent path in the world. And I think we need to think about that and think about a new international political economic order. And for that, we have to have our own thoughts, and we have to cut our own path. And nobody else is going to do it for us. So that much, I think, is clear. So I want to thank you. I've been walking around your campus a lot, and I saw all these cyclamen patches. The botanists tell us that there are at least 23 species of them. I have found 5 or 6 on this campus. They are very beautiful, and they reminded me of a song from Japan. Pardon me? Well, I'm not a botanist, so I cannot tell you the Latin names, but I know enough about flowers to know that they belong to different categories within the same family. And I can show them to you. Then in Japan, when Japan was devastated after the Second World War, they learned some lessons, as I mentioned. So when they had their period of high growth in the 1970s, they started thinking more about other aspects of life, more beautiful aspects of life, and not just be working animals, creating wealth. And this person who used to work for a bank wrote this poem. His name is Kei Ogura, called Shikuramen no Kaori. Shikuramen is the Japanese way of saying cyclamen. I think that my idea of being an economist is to have the kind of thinking and strategic advice that will make economists unnecessary. That instead of talking about economies, we can talk about songs, and we can talk about love, and we can practice a lyricism in real life every day of our lives. And I have great faith in ordinary people, although people can make mistakes. History is full of them. Ultimately, people are resilient. And ultimately, in the long run, it's not the leaders we read about in history book who make history, although they do play, many of them, important roles. But it's really the people and their movements that are important. And finally, I want to emphasize that young people really are the key to a better planetary future. As I get older and older every day, the more and more I want to focus on the young people of this world. And I'm glad that I came back from international organizations to the university, to the world of teaching and research. And it's such a privilege to be with young people and to learn from them and to interact with them and to teach them a few things in the process. But mainly, I learn from them, and I have great faith in the young people of the world, especially the young people in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khan. We will open it up for discussion, but I want to just say welcome to His Excellency, the Ambassador of Bangladesh. Thank you for being with us. And thank you all again for being here. We'll open it up for discussion. You can ask any questions. Try to be brief so we can get in more questions and answers. But speak into the microphone, please.
Lebanon before, but I would like to come back to university and discussions like the one we had today. I like your presentation of Khan, but I have some few points on which I have to rely. The first one, you spoke about agricultural development, but you did not speak about rural development. Because in the rural areas, it's not only agriculture we are looking for development, but also for non-agricultural sector in the rural areas. This is number one. Number two is related to human resource development. I think behind all this, is the system of education we have. Take the country like Lebanon. Soi-disant, we have 64 universities, but actually we don't have more than 8 universities. But if I look at these 8 universities and look at the industrial development, because I want to make my country, Lebanon, the same as Malaysia, as Singapore, as Indonesia, etc., as South Korea. In 2 brackets, South Korea was at the same level as Egypt 25 years ago. But look now at South Korea now, and look at Egypt at the present time. The human resource development education system, especially the education of women. Women are the half of the society in any country. So we have to pay attention to our system of education. Is it really related to development? Is it related to growth, etc., etc.? Now, in my country, in Lebanon, I remember the time when we didn't have any schools for agriculture. Now we have 6 schools of agriculture in Lebanon. That's good. But even if you go into more depth, there are some areas in which we don't have research, we don't have development. Look at farm management, look at production economics, where in India you have developed this tremendously. But why in Lebanon there is nothing. Thank you.
Let's take a few questions. Back, one is here, and then you back here, and then we'll further.
I'm a lawyer. My question is that there is an understanding in Lebanon that underpaying migrant workers, refugee workers, is a source of wealth to the local communities. How would you criticize this kind of approach from an economical and human rights perspective?
Further. Did you have a question? Back there. But come up to the mic, please, so they can hear you.
I speak loudly.
Okay, speak loudly.
Sorry, I'm not an economist. I work in history and literature in the Middle East. I have 2 questions. One is the degree to which workers can unionize and how well organized they are. Because when you speak of youth being the key to a better planetary future and that the people are the real leaders, you have to give them agency and you have to permit them to organize at local levels in ways that might go against your best interests, so to speak. So that's the first question. Second question has to do with the legacy of history. As we look at the crisis in the Middle East, we see that the failed states, while they may have cooperated in their decline, they certainly didn't accomplish it alone. And that the relation between the international community and the regional countries is very complicated. And you didn't really mention much about that, the weight of that history. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much. These are such interesting questions, and I was hoping that such questions would emerge so we can have a meaningful dialogue. First of all, agricultural development, I agree with all the points that were made. Let me just mention from the 2 cases that I mentioned, In Java especially, population density has been very high and people have always had to pay a lot of attention to agriculture. The government had programs that helped the farmers in learning and also in terms of agricultural education, development-related education. They were one of the pioneers in having departments of agriculture in standard universities and special agricultural universities. In Bangladesh, when it was East Pakistan, the first agricultural university was started in Mymensingh. And now, of course, our ambassador from Bangladesh actually knows a lot about agriculture. We had a fascinating discussion yesterday on the phone, and we will talk more, I'm sure. But I worked on a project of International Food Policy Research Institute in Bangladesh. I went to almost all of the 64 districts and talked with the farmers in their language. I take a lot of pride that I still can understand and speak almost all the dialects of our language. So I can speak with some confidence about the progress in education that has been made, and also the progress in policy. And this is, we are talking about a very poor country. In terms of per capita income, Bangladesh is much lower in per capita income terms than Lebanon, certainly, and lower than Indonesia as well. But it is a country that has become self-sufficient in food, even when the population has increased to a size which is twice, at least, that of what it used to be in the 70s. And it has happened because of implementation of policies at the ground level pushed by able government officials, and especially at the ministerial level, but it has to go beyond ministerial level all the way to the ground. And there are inefficiencies even today, but they are not tolerated by the capable officials whom I met and spent a lot of time with. The Minister of Agriculture, Motia Chaudhary, has to be given a lot of credit for this, and the support that she received from the Prime Minister is also very important in this. As you know, politics is partly bureaucratic politics. So if you are not supported by your leader higher up, people below you are not always going to listen to you. And I think non-farm employment is a huge issue in Bangladesh, in Indonesia, every country that I'm familiar with. It's of course even more urgent in Africa. And in terms of creation of employment, one good model is Taiwan. I think Taiwan has not been studied as well as it should be in terms of its own agricultural development and creation of non-farm employment, both in terms of small private sector efforts as well as larger public-private partnerships. So we can talk more. Obviously, you know, these are detailed policy matters that require advice at the nitty-gritty level, because these are not problems that will solve themselves. So I very much appreciate your comments and questions. In terms of the economic critique of paying, of course, part of the problem is what we mean by economic. If you think of it in terms of labor market efficiency, if people put up with discrimination, then yeah, I mean, you are increasing profit, and if those profits are reinvested, you can create economic growth. But even at this narrow level, there are two problems. One is that profits may not be reinvested in the country. They may be simply shipped abroad. And one of the problems of open economy financially, without any regulation, is that it's very easy to just transfer money, and there could be a net drain on the economy. The second problem with this free market approach is that there is something called efficiency wage. If you don't pay people enough, you know, they may not simply have enough to eat right? Their efficiency will suffer, therefore their productivity will be lower, and ultimately it may defeat, the purpose of paying low wages. More broadly, there is a question of social wage. There is a question of what is a just wage, and these are larger political economy issues. And this is related to the question of organization as well. If labor is not organized, if it is a neoclassical kind of model where everybody is isolated and acts in an isolated manner, it may be possible to get away with this. But if people start to organize, and if you look at history everywhere, people have organized under very adverse circumstances. One of the lessons I think activists should learn, and many of them learn almost by osmosis, is that even under very difficult circumstances, you can organize. If that weren't true, then we would not have seen the fall of Stalinist model in former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. So the questions that are important are, A, what is the actually existing situation? What are the constraints? How can we overcome those constraints? And one has to start at the local level, at the concrete level. I have some experience organizing at the concrete local level since my student days, and I didn't stop doing those things when I went to the more affluent land of America. So I can tell you that it is possible, and also it has great human reward. You learn how to listen to people, you learn how to understand them, you learn how to speak their language, you learn how to lose your ego, and you learn how to think more clearly and concretely. You learn things that, in short, are not in any textbook. This other question, of course, is a larger question about legacy of history. And one could very easily write books, and many books have been written. I would say that there are two things to observe. One is history does occur every day at the lower levels. One of the great contributions of the subaltern school of history, about which I have written a little bit, has been to actually look at all these ignored episodes, the hidden history. And the other aspect is it's actually a critique of, let's say, Hegelian idea of history. That Hegel thought only some people had history, other people didn't. And the history was largely a history of nation state. Shakespeare actually knew better. If you read Shakespeare's plays, especially where Falstaff is a key actor, you see that Shakespeare didn't think much of the state. And at that time, state was just beginning to actually raise its ugly head in Elizabethan England. But he saw the danger. But no state is also not a solution, because we have a world system and we have local tyrannies that spring up. So Plato's question still remains very relevant. What is a just state? How do we create justice in the state? And short answer of me is that one must have ideas that are genuinely democratic and a process that is at least locally democratic, and the skill, the persistence, and creativity of the people, and finally courage. We need courage. One of our poets in Bangladesh actually wrote a poem which was very moving. He said that we pray for rain, but we also pray for courageous people. Brishti o sahoshi purusher jonno prarthona. This is one of the greatest poems, I think, that could only have been written after the people have been through the revolutionary process, a process of fighting for national liberation on their own. Poets don't really, come out of thin air. Good poetry is not written simply because somebody is a genius. It's written because there is a history behind all these things that are both collective and personal. So thank you so much.
Here?
Thank you. I just have a couple of questions to the following. You started off the discussion by mentioning the ideological approach of neoliberalism or the left. And of course, we realize that your approach is just as ideological, coming from a Keynesian approach, right? I don't like the term ideological here used as if you seem to paint yourself as an objective, I'm taking this middle approach, but you're, as I believe theological use, and then you say you want to find causal relationships, but you present so many causes that it's difficult for me to understand how we can say, it's just like a theory of everything. These are all the reasons why development happened. And in that sense, it doesn't say much, does it? Because it's saying everything. But what's excluded from this narrative? I mean, like the fourth element, I didn't hear enough about it, although you mentioned glimpses of the global dimension, but it wasn't enough. There was a IMF and the World Bank for intervention in general. The way a country is situated with a global circulation of capital affects its development. It's too statist, I felt, to just see what can we do here and that's it. And what about so I'll link this to now the Middle East, because to me the Middle East cannot be analyzed in this kind of way, in a statist approach. Given the intense amount of foreign intervention, given, for example, the rise of Asian capital, money that just is internationalized, it flows everywhere and affects speculation rates in the whole region. Patrimonialism, we can talk about versatile capitalism in this region, but I mean, I'd like you to take this and give me something to say about the region here. Because I don't think we can just take the Asian model and just say, yeah, let's apply it here and we'll succeed.
I did not say that.
No, I'm saying that. So, what would this information, even if it was totally accurate, give us to, how do we develop? Because to me, it's about what social forces are going to do all these things. Who are we talking about? How do we challenge a global economy that is geared from metropole and periphery that wish to speak in that language by anyways?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have both a confession to make, first of all, and then a very short question related to that confession. My confession is that I really find your worldview, the worldview on which you base your talk, rather too idyllic. And just to give one example, it seems to me that you assume that as long as internal will is available for changing things, for development, then that is sufficient. And I don't think this is really quite our experience. And the question relates to the second point you make, general lessons from people's resilience. People, not leaders, make history in the long run. Our experience in this region is that a third factor or a third group of people are making history, not the people, neither the leaders. I think that one would need to bring into the picture big money, big pharma, oil and gas, multinationals, and those I found rather missing. So how do you reconcile these elements? And I think this relates to the last question in some way. Thank you.
You have to answer those.
Yes, those are both very big questions. I'm very glad that you asked such questions. If I'm permitted to refer to some of my own lectures on YouTube, you can only say so much in 40 minutes or less. I have a lecture on imperialism and finance capitalism that will probably address many of the questions and issues that you have raised. I also have a lecture on what I call towards a new qualitative theory of value, which speaks among other issues, questions of organization. Actually, I'm doing some work on Middle East. I've done some work on Egypt, on human development and the problems and the Arab Spring. So that's available online, and if you send me an email, I will give you the address for that, or you can search on your own. And I'm working on Iran right now. The geoeconomics, geopolitics, of course, that's a very large area. I have a modified framework in my work that I just mentioned of the center-periphery the Wallerstein version of world system. Part of the problem with Wallerstein system is that it ignores the internal struggles, or it ignored until very recently when people pointed out that this was one of the major flaws of the world system theory, and that included me too. So we need to think dialectically. In other words, think both about the internal and the external and the interrelationship between the internal and the external. I am very critical of big money, big finance, and multinationals, and I have written actually quite extensively about these things in other places. But briefly, I think if we think in systemic terms about capitalism as a system of political economy, critically, because subtitle of Marx's Capital is that critique of political economy. So ordinary political economy actually misleads very much. I have to tell my students that constantly. But what would a critical political economy of global capitalism look like? I think in broad terms it's like this. We have really three sets of countries. We have at the top maybe 6 to 10 advanced capitalist countries, which internally also are uneven. America is very uneven internally. It's not a smooth, good for everyone kind of economy as ideologues claim. And I will come back to the question of ideology and respond very briefly at the end. Second tier would be East Asian type of economies or BRICS type of economies, maybe Brazil and India, Russia in terms of its wealth also, and certainly China. China, I think, is a very interesting country because it has gone through so much internal struggle, which is not settled yet. China has the largest number of industrial and other conflicts every year. And if you follow internet debates in Chinese, you find that the Chinese youth, they are going back to what I think is the most profitable part of cultural revolution for the people, where people revolted against the arbitrariness of the state, against the abuse of power by the Communist Party officials, who burned documents in Shanghai and actually formed a commune of Shanghai and wanted to go back to the Paris Commune form of government. So all these interesting things are there, and I hope I'll be still here for the next few days, so I'd love to have dialogues on this. And the third tier are most of these hapless countries in the world. And there also are many interesting stories to tell. I have been part of at least one struggle in Bangladesh. I'm very proud that we succeeded in liberating a nation, but we have not liberated the people yet there, and we must work towards that, and it's a big struggle. Now about ideology and science, I'm not an Althusserian, so I don't believe that ideology would be here forever and ever. In fact, if you come to my Friday talk, I'll criticize Lacan, from whom Althusser takes his idea of imaginary and uses it for ideology. But science is not as hermetic, and if we use objective as it is. There is also an interplay between the subjective and the objective. If you ask me deeply what I believe actually in what Ibn Arabi proposed, but he's a theist, and I'm a theist also, so I'm not one of those Marxists who don't believe in God, because I think Marx was very shallow when it came to religion. Although he was deeper than most, because he talks about religion as the soul of soulless conditions, but he does not go any farther than that. But even at a secular level, we can see that history is made up of both objective and subjective factors, and science also has a history. And so does the critique of political economy as a science. But we have to be very careful here, because we don't want to lapse into subjective idealism. And write a history of science as history of great thinkers like Newton or Einstein. On the other hand, we should know, after the revolution in quantum mechanics, after deeper thinking in social sciences, that the scientist is also a participant in the world, and this certainly is even more true of critical political economy and all social sciences. But it seems to be true of physical sciences as well. But we need to think carefully because one can very easily lapse into a kind of mystical New Age thinking, which I think is very shallow too, and self-satisfied. We cannot, the importance of enlightenment to me really is that although it has many flaws, and it is provincial, but it is critical. And in terms of philosophy, the great contribution of someone like Kant is that after Kant, we can never think, unless we are mystics, you know. I'm a mystic, so I can do that. I can have direct experience. But as scientists, as philosophers, after Kant, we cannot simply, you know, take what we receive directly as the truth. We have to think through these things. We have to think through many mediations of thought in approaching reality. So, well, it's so wonderful. I mean, you ask such interesting questions. I would love to continue the dialogue.
Thank you. Back there? Yeah. Speak into the mic, turn the mic towards you.
Thank you so much. I'll just speak. Thank you so much, Professor. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm really interested in this relationship between the IMF and the local governments that have to implement policies that they might not agree with. And you spoke a little bit about, it was like an anecdote about this woman who, you know, wasn't intimidated by the UN officials and the IMF officials. But I'm curious to learn more about kind of how much the local, you know, local officials in the government that's getting the IMF policies, how much they have in terms of negotiating what happens in their towns and cities, and whether it has to go through the, you know, the government as a whole, or whether, you know, local, smaller municipalities and governments can really change the projects that are happening in their town because of the IMF and stuff like that.
Any other comments, questions?
Okay, this is a wonderful question. I think the best example or examples recently come from Latin America. In Bolivia, for example, in Cochabamba, IMF policy was to privatize water supply. And the people in Cochabamba revolted, and they organized at the local level and succeeded in pushing back IMF. There have been other instances, not just in Bolivia, but also in Venezuela, in Ecuador, and certainly in Brazil. And Argentina, of course, very famously defied IMF, both at the macro level and at the micro level. I saw with my own eyes. I was in Argentina last year, about this time. And they are organizing, self-organizing, you could say, in many different ways. I think it is so important to realize that one does not have to wait for the state to take a stance. One can actually act locally. And you have to think globally in this case because you are dealing with the IMF. I think knowledge is so important here. You have to understand economics in all its different guises, as well as critical political economy. And the more you know about these things, the better off you are in terms of understanding what your genuine interests are and how you must act. Courage itself is not enough, although it is very necessary, because I have seen too many intellectual cowards in my life to not have much respect, you know, for most academics. And I'm an academic myself, so I don't exempt myself from this critique. But we need also knowledge. We must combine courage with knowledge.
Thank you very much for bringing up this idea of local action. I very much believe in that. This is a genuine question. How do you reconcile, again, local action and the extent of benefits that you can get out of local action with the fact that to a large extent there are external forces that may be difficult to overcome in order to arrive at a threshold to achieve development?
Yes, that is so important. It's really a genuinely important question. Local actions can only go so far if they are not generalized, if they are not followed up at other levels. That is, in a way, the failure of the Zapatistas in Mexico. I mean, they did some very good things, and they are still doing some very good things, especially in terms of local good governance, as they call it. But they're isolated. The rest of Mexico is still in the same darkness as it was. They are lucky that Mexican state has not tried to crush them by force, and there are reasons for that we can discuss. But in many parts of the world, successful local examples, if they remain isolated, will sooner or later be crushed. Even in China today, or ignored, really. We have actually Maoist communes in China today. But those are irrelevant for the overall socio-economic political development of China. They may become relevant again if we have massive revolts from below in China. Which I don't see coming next year, but you know, life is a long process. I think in Bolivia, Cochabamba would have been either ignored or crushed, except that there was a nationwide movement which put a much more progressive government in power. So that linkage, I think we need to explore very carefully and contextually and really do very concrete analysis of concrete conditions.
Thank you very much. Before we finish, I just want to say that Professor Khan will be here in Beirut for another 3-4 days. If anybody would like to chat with him or take him to a nice Lebanese lunch, he's interested in people, so you can get in touch with him through the social justice program here at the Issam Finance Institute. I want to thank Leila Abelan there and Sarah Jamal there in the red for doing all the work to bring about this event, and thank you all, and thank Professor Khan.
Thank you.